Welcome everyone back to weekly weather updates, and in today's video we're going to do our third winter 2022-23 look ahead, and we're going to focus on what is happening in the stratosphere over the next few weeks and months. Now, over the last few look aheads, we have alluded to different charts, looking at the ENSO region, QPO, longer range ECMWF charts, but we haven't really touched on the stratosphere, and that's because a lot of the charts hadn't been available. It's been too early in the season, but they are now available, and we are able to see what is going to be happening over the next few weeks from both the CFS, GFS, and the ECMWF ensembles. Now, it does look very interesting, and it does follow on very similar to what we have been seeing over the last few winter look aheads, which is that the early part of winter, second half of November through December, maybe even to January as well, has a higher than average chance of colder weather, in my opinion, from what I'm seeing on these charts. The second half of the winter, so second half of January, February, and probably March as well, perhaps a higher than average chance of big westerly winds, with a lot of our climate drivers pushing towards that. Now, the stratosphere and what's happening with the polar vortex, some would argue, is probably the most important thing for the UK. Whenever we do see a weaker than average stratosphere, any sudden stratospheric warmings, we do tend to see colder than average weather. It doesn't always produce loads of snowfall. Some areas in the south will see nothing at all, but it may be colder than average. So there is always a correlation and causation there, and whenever the stratosphere is above average in terms of westerly winds, like the winter of 2019-20, where we saw pretty much consistent westerly winds with record stratospheric polar vortex strength, we always do see that as well. So the stratosphere is very, very important to what our winter weather is going to be. So that's why we can have a look at it in detail today. So do remember, if you enjoy my videos, make sure you like and subscribe, and remember to follow me on Twitter as well. The link's in the description. Now, of course, we also do have some big thunderstorms around today. For some, as you see, this probably had some very heavy rain earlier this morning, and there could be some more thunderstorms in the east this evening. Now, there still is a yellow warning in force, so do check that out. And if you are interested and you missed the video yesterday, do check that out, which I published yesterday afternoon, which looks at that in detail. Not much of the data has changed. The timings look all the same, and the weather warnings are very much the same as well. The western extent of the warning area has been trimmed, so it is mostly East Anglia, the London area, and southeast England into the East Midlands as well. Those areas are going to be seeing the big thunderstorms perhaps this evening. So do make sure you check out that video, look at the weather warnings, and do stay safe out there. If you see any major changes, perhaps amber warning or anything like that, which I don't think at this stage, but it could be possible, I will update, of course, on social media and on the YouTube as well. So I'll probably post a video if that does happen later. But if not, do check out that video and stay safe out there. But if we do get into the video, the winter look ahead, you can see we're starting on the zonal mean winds at 10 HPA up above the North Pole. Now, this is from theweatheriscool.com. Make sure you do check those out. The link is in the description. It is a very good website for having a look at these charts. Very simple, and you can it's updated every day, and you can have a look both at the short range, medium range, and longer range for the stratospheric sort of updates, what's happening with the polar vortex. Now, you can see here, this chart may be a little bit confusing if you are unsure with it, but if we do go through it by layer, if we actually take off all the forecasts first, the GFS, the uncorrected CFS, and the bias-corrected CFS. Now, if we do look on this, you can see we've got a wide grey area. Now, that is the possible zonal mean winds that we have had up in the stratosphere across the data sets here. So, any grey area is where we are, where we have had the winds before. So you can see sometimes down into January, February, March, April time, it gets down to minus 30 in terms of meters per second up in the stratosphere. But also, equally, in January, February, we've got times where it's gone up to 70 meters per second. So those are the records. And anywhere in that grey area is where the winds have been before. So it is a very wide range. The black line is the average within the middle, and the grey line will be one standard deviation away from that mean. So within the grey, the darker grey, that's where we tend to expect, and that'd be sort of, within reasonable doubt. Anywhere beyond that, so in the lighter grey, that's where we do sort of get away from sort of the average sort of stratospheric conditions. So you can see the dotted red line is where we were last year, reanalysis of last winter. So you can see for most of the early part of the winter, we did track generally around average, maybe late October, early November, we were slightly below average. Perhaps that did help that late November, early December colder snap. But you can see through January and February, we were generally above the mean, and we actually got into quite high levels, well above the mean through February into March. And yeah, that did mean we had a lot of westerly winds, very strong westerly influence. You can see some very up and downs through March and April, and that's why we did see some colder snaps at times, and that's because we did see very, very big oscillating westerly flow up in the stratosphere before it generally all trends towards slightly below zero through the summer, where it is pretty much tightly packed. There is very little deviation until around this time of the year. So that's why it's really no point looking at it until we get to around late October into November. Now you can see a blue line on the left. That's where we actually are this year, and you can see a few weeks ago, maybe even 2 weeks ago, you can see we are almost record weak in terms of polar vortex strength, but it's so early in the season, it's a very small deviation from average, and you can see actually right now we are around average within the darker grey, so pretty much near what we'd expect this time of year. So you can see that massive spread does come, and the big uncertainty starts to arrive really through November, and that's where we can see big changes. If we wanted to see a weaker, if we want to see a colder than average start to the winter, which is suggested by the ENSO, La Nina forecast, which is suggested by a lot of the medium to longer range models, and what we have alluded to over the last few updates, we'd expect this potentially to be below average if we did want the stratosphere to also accompany that. So, if we do put on the GFS, now this is the GFS ensemble, is only covering the next 2 weeks, and you know by having a look at the in our daily videos, the GFS ensembles beyond about 7 days do fluctuate massively, and you can see the huge spread there is into early November. But you can see for the time being we are going to be around average to the end of October, and then to the start of November, quite a few are above average, but quite a few are below average as well. Quite a big spread there. But generally, nothing too crazy in terms of anything too consistent and too close together, deviating from the average. So nothing too much in the GFS is showing up. But it is the CFS, which is the very long range, the sort of monthly look ahead models that are suggesting that we could be seeing a weaker than average polar vortex. Now, if we do put on the uncorrected CFS, look at all these blue or turquoisey lines, all well below average, and most of them are below that darker grey area for quite a foreseeable period of time through November and most of December, before all returning more towards average into early January. Now, there is a bias with the CFS, that's why we have a bias corrected CFS here, so the CFS tends to bias weaker than average, so we always do have to correct it a little bit, so these are biased, but you can see the raw CFS is showing a very weak polar vortex through November and December. That would suggest a higher than average chance of colder weather through the start of the winter. And if we put on the bias corrected CFS, just get a little bit messy here, you can see it actually very similar through November and early December with the bias corrected, because it's probably a shorter range, there's less uncertainty, is well below average, still mostly within the lighter grey area, so nothing we haven't seen before, but very much below average, getting close to zero, and some even going for a reversal in the zonal mean winds up at 10 HPA, which would suggest potentially some stratospheric warming, and you can see we have had some stratospheric warmings in December before with these sharp spikes before. Could we be seeing something else appearing here? Again, it's only one or two CFS runs, but you can see the majority are just in the lighter grey area, so what we've seen before, but very weak nonetheless. But the bias corrected does, around middle of December, return pretty much all of the CFS members to average, if not well above average, and one on some member goes off the charts at the top there. So that very much does follow what we've been seeing in our other winter look-aheads, which is a higher than average chance of colder than average conditions towards the start of the winter. Of course, anything that happens in the stratosphere takes a week to 2 weeks to propagate through the atmosphere. So if we did see weaker than average zonal winds through the start of December, it could impact the middle of December, perhaps into the Christmas period. But then as soon as we return those zonal mean winds to average, if not above average, during the middle to end of December, that could mean January, February is more westerly dominated. So it is very interesting that we are seeing this, where both the ENSO, La Nina, it does suggest a colder start to the winter. The Met Office have alluded to it on their look-aheads, their outlooks. The ECMWF charts that we're actually going to have a look at in a minute do suggest it. And now the longer-range CFS zonal mean winds at 10 HPA also suggest a higher chance. Again, we have to reiterate, there's no guarantees, just a lot of the big climate drivers are suggesting that they are setting up perhaps for a higher than average chance colder starts the winter, but then a higher than average chance of a milder or wetter second half of the winter, because we're seeing that from these CFS charts here. So perhaps a very weak polar vortex through November into the middle of December again would be very, very interesting when to see what's going to happen with this once we get it into the shorter range. It still is a number of weeks away, at least 3-4 weeks away from seeing any potentially colder weather, anything meaningful at least. So we are still quite a way away when it comes to sort of shorter range models, but these long range models are still showing colder than average, and that's been consistent because we've been in these winter look-aheads. It's our third one now, and we're still seeing this signal. And when we have a look at the ECMWF weekly pressure anomalies in a minute, you'll see that signal is there as well. Now, if we go over to the ECMWF charts, we'll have a look at the stratosphere charts. You can see that we're around average at the moment. We actually go slightly above average towards the start of November. That is what the GFS ensembles from the weatheriscool.com was suggesting. Slightly above average. Some going quite strong, some slightly weaker. But as we head through the end of November towards the start of December, there is definitely a trend to go slightly below average. And there are quite a few, maybe a quarter to a third, that go very weak and that go below the red line. And the red line here is the 90th or 10th and 90th percentile. So again, just a measure of what's sort of in reason. Anything below that red line is really, really quite weak, and anything above that red line is really quite strong. And there definitely are more weaker runs here than stronger ones. So definitely suggesting the ECMWF extended range ensembles for the 10 HPA winds are definitely also suggesting perhaps weaker than average polar vortex through the second half of November. But you can see a lot more ensemble members here, probably higher resolution than the CFS. They're not as bullish, but the signal is definitely still there. So it's very interesting seeing that once again. And you can see that one towards the start of December is off the charts, almost at the bottom there, towards minus 15 meters per second, which is exceptionally weak. That is some stratospheric warming level, and that could produce an extremely cold December, and of course maybe even a snowy Christmas period if we saw something like that. Again, it's one ensemble member. There are quite a few, as I said, maybe a third to a quarter that are well below average, but we will have to see exactly how it plays out. But if you are looking for a colder weather, these charts today from the stratosphere are encouraging for colder weather towards the start of winter. But of course, from what the CFS was showing, not as encouraging for the second half of winter. So January, February, March time, perhaps being milder and wetter than average. So really, really interesting seeing this continue today. Now, if we do go over to the ECMWF weekly 500 HPA height anomalies. Now, this is towards the surface. And you'd expect what happens in the stratosphere does propagate through and affects these weekly anomalies. Now, these weekly anomalies, as we've alluded to in the last couple of videos, are not the exact weather every week. It's the general positioning of low pressure, high pressure. Of course, there's going to be transient northerlies, transient southerlies, things like that. So it's not going to produce the exact air masses all the time, but it can show us the general pattern within the North Atlantic towards the UK and Northwest Europe. So we're going to have to be interesting to see, are we still seeing blocking signal over the top of us and to our north through the middle of November, which we saw last week and we saw the week before. And you can see low pressure running in off the Atlantic at the moment with a southerly flow, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now and in the shorter range with warmer than average conditions and very westerly flow. For the first week of November, very similar signal, but high pressure replaces that lower pressure towards the mid-Atlantic, and that means still very unsettled, still westerly, but veering more west to northwesterly, so perhaps not quite as mild, so cooler, more typical autumnal conditions, more towards average probably in terms of upper air temperatures. Through the middle of November, less signal, but still sort of a west to southwesterly flow, low pressure running in there, maybe very similar to what we have at the moment. So again, nothing cold. But the week after, those blues, again, a very weak signal towards Scandinavia, higher pressure towards Iceland, Greenland, northeast Canada, blocking out the jet stream. Again, not a huge signal, but quite a large signal for 3 or 4 weeks ahead. You can see that would produce a northerly wind, colder than average conditions, more than likely. And as we head towards the 21st to the 28th of November, the week after, high pressure over the top of us and to our north. Again, most likely propagating a north to easterly wind. You can see these blues, that's where the jet stream is probably sinking southwards towards Spain and Portugal, southerly tracking jet, and we would be on the colder side. Now it is end of November, it's not the coldest time of the year by any means, but we can see colder weather. So very interesting seeing that. If we did see a persistent northerly or easterly, we would be plunged into the freezer. Yes, the upper air temperatures probably won't be as cold as they could be in January, February or March time, but because it's got such weak solar energy, the days can get very, very cold, the nights can get very, very cold, and we could see snowfall within that, even though it's 4 weeks away, and at the moment we're seeing temperatures around 20 degrees. It is possible to see the weather flip that quickly through November. And for the last into early December, high pressure to our north, all the way towards Greenland, Scandinavia and Iceland, a massive high pressure signal. Again, this could just produce high pressure over the top of us, an inversion, colder than average weather, but no snow or anything like that. But it could also suggest easterly winds, and if we did see an easterly wind, it would be very cold through early December or at least late November. If we did see a persistent blocking signal, sometimes early in the winter or late autumn we can see an easterly wind, but because the near continent is still quite mild, it doesn't produce anything. But this is showing sort of 2 or 3 weeks of persistent higher pressure to our north. It won't be there the whole time, but it'll be fairly persistent, and that will mean cold air most likely will gather over Europe, Scandinavia to a certain extent, which means when we do put in an easterly, it could be quite cold. So we'll have to see what it is showing next week, but still, for the second half of November, from around middle of November onwards, definitely a blocking signal. So some people are probably thinking we're not seeing this at all on the daily videos, but that's because the GFS only looks 2 weeks ahead. So at the moment that's looking into the first week of November, and you saw by these weekly mean anomalies it's still a westerly flow, so we're not expecting to see any of this within the shorter time frame, perhaps for at least a week or two. When I mean shorter time frame, I mean in our daily videos on the GFS operational runs and on the ensemble members. We won't expect to see any persistent signal like that for at least another week or two, so we'll have to keep an eye on it. But the stratosphere suggesting colder than average start of winter perhaps. The CFS weekly anomalies still are suggesting blocking towards the second half of November into early December as well. So the signals are still there this week. That is the most important thing. You can get these anomalous runs where we see huge blocking, but it's the consistency of this. It's that every week we do this, every time I look at these charts, there still is that blocking signal. So there is definitely a signal within the atmosphere. We'll just have to see if it comes to fruition over the next few weeks. Now, if you finish the video by having a look at the CFS, a little bit of fun, of course, we'll just run through this. This is the midday run from yesterday. It's fully loaded, and if we just run it through over the next sort of couple of weeks, I guess a couple of months, we'll probably go through to the January, February time. You can see generally a westerly flow at the moment. It's nothing too drastic. A bit of blocking as towards middle of November in terms of higher pressure, but nothing too crazy, nothing particularly cold. Even towards the second half of November, high pressure around, but still generally a westerly flow. A bit of an easterly there temporarily, but nothing too crazy. But it's as we head towards middle of December, perhaps very cold weather, northerly winds coming in there with blocking towards Greenland. That would be very cold and snowy and quite persistent with a southerly tracking jet. Nothing too much happens after that, a bit of a westerly flow, and as we head into middle of January, basically cold easterly, and remaining fairly cold through a lot of January to the start of February, and then we see consistent, persistent colder weather perhaps potentially there. So yeah, this is not following on what we saw the last couple of updates, where definitely a colder start to winter. There was a bit of a cold snap during December, a few brief northerly flows here or there, but nothing too crazy. Colder weather actually coming later in the winter, so you can see the CFS today still showing some colder weather here or there, but again, it is a very experimental run, this individual operational run 4 times a day. So a bit of fun. You can see there is colder weather perhaps from this, but again, definitely maybe a signal for colder starts, but seeing colder weather during the second half of the winter, where I do definitely think it will be westerly dominated, is interesting to say the least. We'll have to keep an eye on this over the next few weeks, but at the moment, still the signal for a colder start of the winter. Stratosphere looking very, very interesting, and it'll be good to watch what happens over the next week or two, of course, whether we see the signal persist, because the next sort of 2 weeks probably, as we head into the early part of November, will sort of be crunch time. Will we see the signal persist? Will we see it creep into the 14-day time frame? If we do see that, I do think we've got a very high chance of seeing at least colder snaps, if not quite persistent colder weather. But at the time being, they are look-aheads, they are experimental, and they are longer range, which we do know can fluctuate and can be biased sometimes. But with the persistency of this, with numerous different climate drivers going for a similar sort of idea, I do think there is a good chance we do see at least some cold weather, at least for the north, through some parts of November into December, and could be widespread as well, if these sort of signals do properly come off. So anyway, thanks for watching. Make sure you do stay safe in those thunderstorms this evening if you are out there in the east, and I'll see you again for another video soon.